Aloha mai kako. You are watching Hawaii Political Reporter.
Welcome, friends. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and you are tuned into the Asia Pacific Perspective, that monthly series whereby myself and Brock West of APPerspective.net go over all of the latest news and information coming out of the Asia Pacific region that is being kept track of on a regular daily basis at APPerspective.net. I hope people are checking into that for the latest news and headlines that are coming out from the AP region. Brock, always great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. What's on the plate for this month?
James, as always, the pleasure is all mine. And yeah, we are a little bit overdue for our monthly AP Perspective, so it's definitely great to be back with you. For our first segment, James, we're going to cover Asia-Pacific protests. There's been quite a few protests that have been going on. Obviously, we've got Thailand and everything, but recently here in Australia, we've just had the nationwide March demonstrations against the policies of our puppet-in-chief, Tony Abbott, and his administration. However, the week before the protest took place, the southern state of Victoria, the parliament there, were very busy passing through a law that will have some potentially serious ramifications as we move closer towards the G20 here in November. And we'll take this story from conspiracyoz.com. Protesters who participated in last week's March in Melbourne could have protested their final cause. Last week, a new law was passed in the Victorian State Parliament, colloquially dubbed the anti-protest law by its opposers. Despite a demonstration by unionists protecting the anti-protest law, it was passed in the upper house of the Victorian Parliament on Tuesday, March 11. The decision was met with outrage from the public gallery. Protesters stormed the state parliament to express their opposition to the new law. Up to 20 protesters entered the public gallery shortly after 8 p.m. and began chanting and yelling at the members of parliament. Police were called in to remove the demonstrators, who were forcibly escorted from the building. The amended Summary Offences Act, or anti-protest law, will give police greater powers to take action against protesters who are blocking access to buildings, obstructing people in traffic, or who could turn violent. The new law also specifies a police move-on order. The change will also enable courts to issue exclusion orders preventing troublemakers from entering a particular public space for up to 12 months. Some of the members of the public chaos chose to share their reaction to the new law on social media. This law passed just days before the March in March protest in Melbourne, which was part of a larger national event. And James, before I get your response to that, elsewhere throughout the region, we've seen quite a handful of forceful demonstrations in Taiwan over a very unpopular trade pact with China, with protesters there also storming government buildings. Over in your backyard in Japan, we've seen large-scale protests against the Japanese government's move to push forward the restart of Japan's idle nuclear reactors, and even some TEPCO employees making a stand against the company's running of the ongoing Fukushima situation. And also, finally, in somewhat of a positive note, I guess, the state of emergency has been lifted in Thailand after it was implemented by the Thaksin regime there 2 months ago. So, James, take your pick. Wherever you look in the Asia Pacific, there are signs that people are at least angry, concerned, and fed up with the actions of their misleaders.
It is interesting to see that meme sort of spreading across the region, and we'll definitely have to keep our eye on the various protest movements that are popping up. But on the Australian story specifically, this is specifically in the Victorian Parliament. So this is only the state of Victoria that's being affected by this.
That's correct. At this stage, yes.
At this stage. But as I'm sure a lot of the people out there will know by now, the upcoming G20 is going to be held in Brisbane in Queensland state, which is not too far away, and which, at any rate, we know they're already starting to make their preparations for the protests, the inevitable protests at the G20 in Brisbane. Any comment on how that might play into this?
Well, I'm sure the parliamentarians here in Queensland will be licking their lips and eagerly awaiting to see how this pans out. I mean, it's a very convenient trump card for the powers that shouldn't be here in Queensland to have up their sleeve when the inevitable protests do happen in Brisbane later in the year. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And also, there has been quite a few developments, not so much recently, but over the last few months, in terms of G20, where people who live within the exclusion zone of Brisbane CBD will not be allowed to leave their homes while the political leaders of the world are on the move. And also there was rumblings of people not being allowed to wear black, black clothes and everything like this is obviously in response to the Black Bloc protesters that took place in Toronto and Pittsburgh, etc., which of course we know were more likely than not some type of agent provocateur or the like. So yeah, very interesting and also very worrying times. So I hope people are keeping the G20 and the upcoming developments in the back of their minds, because they are just going to keep trickling out, and all of a sudden by the time we reach the G20 in Brisbane in November, we're going to be staring at a very, very different climate here in Queensland, that's for sure.
Absolutely right. And as I say, we'll be keeping our eye not only on that, but of course all of the various protest movements across the region. So let's move on to the next story.
Sure, James. Well, along with the protests that are going along around the Asia Pacific, of course, something you and I have talked about quite a bit on Asia Pacific Perspective is the regional military build-up. It's happening all over the place. We'll take this first story from philstar.com. The headline reads, "Ban on foreign military bases not absolute." The constitutional provision banning foreign military bases and troops in the Philippines is not absolute, even as the Philippines and the US are close to forging a new security agreement to increase the presence of American forces in the country. Rodolfo Biazon, a former armed forces chief, reiterated the need to determine any constitutional role that may be played by Congress in implementing or sanctioning the proposal to allow American soldiers to increase their rotational presence and use of military bases in the country. Article 18, Section 25 of the 1987 Constitution states that foreign military bases, troops or facilities shall not be allowed in the Philippines except under a treaty duly concurred in by the Senate and when the Congress so requires, ratified by a majority of the votes cast by the people in a national referendum held for that purpose, and also being recognised as a treaty by the other contracting state. Once again, moving back to your home, in your backyard, sorry, James, we take this next story from defencenews.com. Japan draws up overhaul of arms export ban. Quote, "Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party has drawn up plans to overhaul the pacifist country's self-imposed ban on arms exports. The government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has delivered the blueprint to lawmakers in his party and coalition partner, New Komeito, according to an LDP official, with the Premier looking for a green light from Cabinet by the end of this month. The relaxed rules could allow Tokyo to supply weaponry to nations that sit along important sea lanes to help them fight piracy, and also help resource-poor Japan, which depends solely on mineral imports. Japan's arms could potentially be shipped to Indonesia as well as other nations around the South China Sea through which fossil fuels pass, such as the Philippines, for example, which has an ongoing territorial dispute with Beijing." And for our third and final story in this segment, James, China announces military spending increase, this one coming out of Al Jazeera. Quote, "China has announced its biggest rise in military spending in 3 years, a strong signal from President Xi Jinping that Beijing is not about to back away from its growing assertiveness in Asia, especially in disputed borders." The government said on Wednesday it would increase the defence budget by 12.2% this year to 808.23 billion yuan, which is roughly about 131 billion US dollars, partly to develop more high-tech weapons and to beef up coastal air defences. So, James, another month and continued increase of a US military presence and tension-raising military drills that we've seen on the South Korean peninsula. Also, potentially dangerous constitutional and defence policy reforms in Japan, and also military spending increases on all sides, not just China. So, all signs point to precarious times ahead, if you ask me. So, feel free to speak on any or all of these, James. But also, just quickly turning back here to Australia, the Abbott government also recently announced that they're planning on buying a new fleet of US Triton surveillance drones to secure resources in the Indian Ocean. So there's nothing that should be too shocking or surprising to those who have been following the developments here in the Asia Pacific, but still important for us to bring it to people's attention.
It certainly is, and it is important to keep this in front of people's attention as we, of course, get not distracted, but of course our attention turns to what's happening in Ukraine and there in Eastern Europe, obviously the geopolitical hotspot of the moment. It's important to keep in mind that the Asia-Pacific pivot is proceeding apace, and that it is not just a U.S.-driven policy, that all of the players in the region are, of course, participating in this, and China doing its part as well with the increasing its defense budget. There has been some talk in recent weeks about whether or not the Asia-Pacific pivot is in jeopardy because of the defense budget cuts that are ongoing in the United States right now. But there's something from the Register Citizen that I'll post in the show notes here, just basically saying that the United States is promising to maintain its strengthen its military presence in the AP region, and that the cuts will not be significantly affecting the Pacific Fleet. So again, everything is continuing to build up here, perhaps quietly at this point. A lot of the attention has turned to Eastern Europe, but it is still going on here, and still something that we need to be concerned about, as this continues to be a potential flashpoint for future conflicts. And I still think that some of the marine and naval incidents here could be that spark for conflict that might come out of left field at some point in the near future, or at least in the future.
Exactly right. I mean, and just speaking of that point you just made there, we also saw recently North Korea lobbing missiles, as they do from time to time, into the Sea of Japan, and it was claimed that these missiles came somewhat close to a Chinese passenger jet. So, I mean, it's those type of those serious incidents, I should say, that I could really be the spark for the powder keg that's going on here right now. James, moving on to our third and final story today, we are going to cover. Although it very quickly dropped out of the 24/7 news cycle. Earlier this month, there was a pretty horrific knife attack in a Kunming train station, which left 33 people dead, including some of the attackers. Since then, the Chinese government and media have pinned the attacks on the East Turkestan Islamic movement, and as this article from ChinaDigitalTimes.net spells out in more detail. After the deadly Kunming train station attack on March 1, it highlighted growing tensions between the predominantly Muslim Uyghur ethnic group and China's majority Han ethnicity. A leader of the militant separatist Turkestan Islamic Party has promised more attacks on China. According to Reuters, Pakistani security sources, hundreds of Uyghurs moved to the unruly northern Waziristan region of the Afghan-Pakistan border after China cracked down in Xinjiang following the 2009 riots in Budimiki. China, Pakistan's closest military, economic and strategic ally, has been putting increased military pressure on the Islamic Republic to root out Uyghur separatists, and their numbers in the region are now believed to be much smaller. The Reuters report linked above continues to quote the head of the Pakistani FATA Research Center, who says that China is exaggerating the power of the group. Quote, it's survival basically. They can't go back. This is the only place where they're welcome. The Turkestan Islamic Party, still commonly referred to as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, took credit for the numerous attacks in China in 2008, though the intelligence organisations have said that their claims of responsibility appear exaggerated. After the October 2013 Tiananmen Jeep crash, Abdullah Mansour made a public statement labelling the crash a jihadi operation, while Beijing blamed the March 1 attack on the Kunming train station on Xinjiang separatist forces. However, Mansour did not claim responsibility for the violence in his brief interview with Reuters. James, I know yourself and Sibel Edmonds of BallingFrogsPost.com covered this in the Gladio B series, but for those like me who need a bit of a mental refresher, give us your thoughts on the significance of not only this attack in Kunming, but also China's response, but also more importantly, the wider geopolitical narrative that has been underlying the events in Western China for years now.
Well, I hope people will follow the links to that article that you're reading from, as well to the Reuters article that they're citing from, because I think that gives a pretty clear stance of what exactly this is all about. And in fact, it reads exactly like the type of propaganda that we saw about Al-Qaeda in the run-up to 9/11, including this shadowy rebel leader, Abdullah Mansour, who's hiding in some shadowy cave somewhere, issuing these pronouncements and doing interviews and issuing videos that are only being monitored by sight, which, again, for people who know the Al-Qaeda story, is an interesting parallel. I mean, it's almost exactly parallel. So we have this new Osama bin Laden figure, this Abdullah Mansour, who's doing the same thing to China that he was threatening that Osama was threatening all along with the United States. And it is interesting to look at that parallel, especially in light of that information, as you say, that Sibel Edmonds brought up in the Gladio B series, which again is probably one of the most important reports that I've ever issued. So I hope people will go back and refresh their memory on that. But basically, yes, the Turkestan independence movement has its supposed self-proclaimed president leader in exile in Washington, and is, as according to Sibel, is part of the Gladio B operation to support the Islamic terror on the doorstep of China and Russia. And there it is in Xinjiang. And presumably, they may have been involved in this Kunming knife attack. Again, I don't think there's been any specific proof of this yet, or that's been specifically presented, other than some literal flags that I believe were found at the scene of the crime. So maybe a literal false flag, maybe a real flag. I don't know at this point. But at any rate, it is an interesting story, and I think that this will play more and more into certainly what's happening in China and their response, and at any rate, even if this is an attack on them, it does give them the excuse to build up their own security state in response to the supposed terror threat, in the exact same way that the U.S. has used 9/11 and the Al Qaeda threat, boogeyman threat, to build up their own security state. So ultimately, who wins in these games is it's the centralized power and authority always takes out more centralized power and authority in response to these threats. So it's an interesting phenomenon to be watching, and I hope people are keeping their eye on places like Global Times and other Chinese government mouthpieces for sort of the latest propaganda about what's really going on there.
Exactly right. And also, just on a completely related note, I also saw recently, I think it was from Al Jazeera, but don't quote me on that. Also, the Pakistani ISI has come out saying with numerous officials knew of Osama bin Laden's whereabouts for years before anything like that. And of course, I hope everyone's got their critical thinking caps on, but of course we all know who the ISI are, who the ISI are funded by, which of course are the CIA and the US military industrial apparatus. So always important to have your critical thinking caps on when any kind of these events take place. So yeah, James, it's been 3 important stories as always. So as always, people can keep up to date with AP Perspective via RSS feed, via my Twitter account, which is @BrockWest, and also via the AP Perspective Twitter account, which is @AP_Perspective.
I think people out there will also understand how it is always in the name of protecting the children that some of the most draconian legislation can be backdoored in, because no one's going to complain to see these disgusting pedophile advocates being thrown in jail. Obviously, that's a good thing, but through that public fear, of course, they can conduit in all sorts of draconian laws, which will then be turned against other citizens in ways that we should learn to expect, but we're not expecting. So again, with the internet legislation that comes along, it's always about stopping child pornography, and it always ends up turning against people who are downloading movies or what have you. So again, we have to be careful of that angle in this story and what's really at stake with this. But just as a further reinforcement of what I was saying earlier about the pedophile rings at the top, I saw another article, again from the Daily Mail, from a week or 2 ago that I thought was interesting. Bill Clinton identified in lawsuit against his former friend and pedophile Jeffrey Epstein, who had regular orgies at his Caribbean compound that the former president visited multiple times. And that is a pretty horrific story when you get into the details, and the fact that this man was keeping underage sex slaves at his Caribbean island and flying Bill Clinton out on his private jet on multiple occasions. So again, we know this stuff goes on. We know that these people are involved in this, but we also have to be careful about the types of laws that are brought in to combat this.
One other related that I'll tie in, James, was sent to me via Twitter @DazAltTheory, and it stays on the tabloid note. But again, I find it fascinating, I think, because the British have this sort of tabloid nature, because we don't have it here in the States. It does, because they're just into exposing anything that'll sell papers, they do actually expose sometimes worthwhile things. So it's interesting to note that heard for a long time about the Madeleine McCann kidnapping, missing child. It took 7 years for the UK now to announce that a well-known and convicted British pedophile was living right next to the resort where Madeleine McCann was kidnapped. So that comes from the Mirror. So, James, we've got the Daily Mail and we've got the Mirror. Let's now, for our second story, we've had the bizarre sex. Now let's have the drugs. And again, I'll take it from the UK Independent, and of course submitted to us by our good friend on Twitter @GJ Salisbury. Vatican-bound cocaine-filled condoms seized by German customs. German customs intercepted 12 ounces of liquid cocaine with a street value of some 40,000 euros, which is about 55,000 US dollars, and it was bound for the Holy See's city-state. What's more, the drugs were held inside 14 condoms, something that not even Pope Francis has, as of yet, felt he could endorse the use of. Officers at the Leipzig airport found the cocaine inside a shipment of cushions coming from South America. The package was simply addressed to the Vatican Postal Office, meaning it could have been collected by any of the state's 800 residents. Subsequently, German officers handed the package over to the Vatican police, who set up a sting operation in an attempt to capture the intended recipient, but no one claimed the drugs. German authorities think that shows the person was tipped off. A spokesman for the German Finance Ministry, which oversees the Customs Office, has verified this report. James?
This is, what do you make of this story, especially the irony of it being shipped in condoms? I mean, this is, it's off the charts, isn't it? And I guess whenever I think of Vatican corruption, my mind always goes back to the Banquet of Chestnuts. And for people who don't know what that is, I'll throw that in as a little Easter egg in the links. So please click on the link to find out more about that if you don't know about that little episode from history. But it does really raise the question of the types of corruption that go on in the Vatican that we know about and has been uncovered time and time again through papacy after papacy, and absolutely, seemingly with no exception in the modern era. So again, we can't exactly lay this at the feet of Pope Francis. I mean, who knows to what extent who was involved in this or what it was. My initial thought on seeing the headline to this story is, oh, it must have been some sort of prankster or something, but I don't think pranksters send 40,000 euros of cocaine on just as a joke. So this is obviously something that was going on, coordinated obviously with someone inside who obviously was tipped off, so the sting didn't end up catching him. But again, it just raises the specter of the corruption that goes to the core of the Vatican, and that haunted Benedict before Francis as well. And in fact, it brings to my mind the story of Benedict's retirement, that whole bizarre story that still I don't think has ever been fully explained, but it did bring up to my mind an interesting article from March of 2010, I believe. Papal aide, Vatican singer fired over alleged gay prostitute ring that apparently was operating there in the Vatican. So again, it just corruption after corruption after corruption, and it just doesn't seem to stop. And this is the most holy, revered institution in the world, or so they want you to believe. And unfortunately, the rot is right there at the top.
James, I'll include a couple of other relateds. 2 articles I put into one tweet. Drug cartels rely on big banks to launder profits. And at the border, the drugs go north and the cash goes south. Interestingly enough, both these articles, one comes from NPR, the other comes from OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, and they both talk about how the Sinaloa cartel runs their money through banks such as HSBC, and the article goes through so many other things. You might have heard of the Sinaloa cartel in the news lately because they've busted one of its latest leaders, that's El Chapo Guzman. And the last related, James, I'll throw in is a flashback to June of 1999, when the head of the New York Stock Exchange, Richard Grasso, met with the Colombian FARC rebels and said, "You guys have got a lot of money. You should invest it in the New York Stock Exchange." James, any comment about those before we move to our third and final segment this week?
Not really. Just to say business as usual in the New World Order.
So we've had the sex, we've had the drugs, and now we have not the rock and roll, but the resources. Sanctions against Russia? Well, don't tell ExxonMobil. This from the always interesting allgov.com. Imposing sanctions against Russia for its takeover of Crimea would not sit well with ExxonMobil, the United States' largest oil corporation. Now, ExxonMobil may be based in the United States, but that doesn't mean it's an American company, not in the sense that its interests and those of the nation coincide. Sometimes they might have shared interests, but in the case of Russia's power play in the Ukraine, ExxonMobil has far too much invested in America's former Cold War nemesis to see the U.S. government, led by President Barack Obama, get in its way of making money. While the White House searches for ways to punish Putin for annexing Crimea, it's business as usual, just as you said, James, for ExxonMobil inside Russia. 2 years ago, the American oil giant signed a lucrative deal with Rosneft, Russia's petrochemical behemoth, to jointly explore offshore oil and gas in the Kara Sea in the Arctic Ocean and the Black Sea, where the Crimean Peninsula is. As part of this agreement, Rosneft acquired a 30% stake in 20 ExxonMobil offshore oil and gas exploration blocks in the Gulf of Mexico. This arrangement has not been compromised by the Ukraine crisis. And James, as long as we're talking about oil, I think it's interesting to note, and sad and disgusting and infuriating, oil spill shuts down a Houston ship channel right on the 25th anniversary of the Exxon Valdez spill. And even more recently, BP spills unknown amount of tar sands into Lake Michigan, and that story is still developing. James?
Well, exactly right. That is particularly sad irony there. But on the note of Russia and the sanctions, for anyone who's been reading the International Forecaster, I have been writing about this for weeks now. I think that these sanctions are all hot air. That's why we've only seen bark and definitely no bite so far with the sanctions. And I don't think we're likely to see any, precisely because of this, because of the interlocking nature of the multinationals that bear no allegiance to the United States or any particular country and are operating in Russia, so they don't want their interests messed with, and they won't be, trust me. They will not be messed with by these sanctions one way or another. So it's all smoke and mirrors being played out right now, and I think that this just feeds into the larger global agenda, which, as that article does point out, has nothing to do with multinational corporations being beholden to U.S. interests or any other national interests. They are only beholden to their corporate owners. And of course, what is ExxonMobil other than one of the seven sisters of Rockefeller, the Rockefeller dynasty? So we know who's really puppeteering this from behind the scenes. And of course, this leads into the specter of the new Cold War. Meet the new Cold War, same as the old Cold War, which, as we know from people like Anthony Sutton, was provided completely by support, technological and otherwise, military, financial, from the West. And that's how it was built up. And that is exactly what is happening now, as you're about to reveal in a related story. And as Anthony Sutton also talked about in his work, he even predicted back in the 1990s when he was writing, or 1980s, when he was writing in, for example, America's Secret Establishment, he predicted that China would become one of the world's leading economies by the year 2000. He said, well, switch that with 2010, and we're pretty much there, based on the interlocking deals and contracts that are made with multinational corporations from the West with China. And he was seeing it there taking place in the build-up to the Chinese behemoth, with some of the contracts that were being signed in the latter part of the 20th century, but they're continuing, and not only China, but Russia. So once again, the whole Cold War mentality that's being built up right now is all smoke and mirrors.
And I think to drive that home even more, great related from Blacklisted News and Judicial Watch, U.S. gives Russia free military equipment. The secret operation was exposed this past week by members of the U.S. Congress that discovered it going through the 2014 budget and the 2015 budget proposals. And again, all the smoke and mirrors in the show and the sanctions will not affect really any of this. James, I think in a way this episode, this is, I think, from the earliest planning of it, should show that all of the revered institutions, from the churches to the banks to your so-called elected officials, are completely effed. They're all completely lawless criminals, and they should be treated and regarded as such. So having said that, I'll just quickly mention a couple of our updates and a couple of stories submitted via Twitter, #NewWorldNextWeek. Abu Ghaith, Osama's son-in-law, has been convicted in his terror trial. We covered that story in full for a few weeks ago for you here on New World Next Week. And a couple of stories submitted to us, which you can do on Twitter using #NewWorldNextWeek. Again, an update on the ongoing saga of the Flight 370 out of Malaysia, gets into the AWACS hijacking, sabotage, and propaganda. And I'll also note I actually just did an interview with Niall Bowie, who is based in Malaysia, RT reporter. And we talked about, in addition to Ukraine and China and Japan, we talked about Malaysia and Flight 370. Another interesting one from @Mamik, spyware app turns the privacy tables on Google Glass wares. And finally, YouTube enlists trusted flaggers to police videos. And James, I think as we close this, we'll throw that out to the audience to say, don't let that happen.
Well, that's the point. And I was just listening to your interview with Niall Bowie today, so I will recommend that. It was a good conversation. And unfortunately, we had a rather somber conversation today about business as usual in the New World Order and the corruption of every institution imaginable.
Composite American Constitution. 1913, corrupting the system. Devalue dollar, hyperinflation. The Federal Reserve, controlled by Lucifer. He can see you lying in your eyes. You know in high from Judge Jesus Christ. Hallelujah. No